Hello and welcome to session number 2 in the series of lectures on the history of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. I'm recording today's lecture at the Siler's Chapel Church of God just outside of Williamsburg, Kentucky. This congregation was established somewhere around 1906 from members who had been excluded from the nearby Patterson Creek and Maple Creek United Baptist churches over the doctrine of holiness. In March 1908, the congregation constructed a new sanctuary on this property, I'm told just to the right side of the present location. This location is historically significant because of its selection as the site of the 5th General Assembly, a very monumental event that we're going to talk about here today. When John Parks, Alan Moses, and John Smitty, James and Isaac Jones served as a committee on constitutional name, they chose the name Holiness Union Association to identify them with the Church of God movement. To them, Church of God meant the Holiness Church. And so they were unaware that the same year, another holiness association in the mountains of southeastern Tennessee and western North Carolina had adopted the name Church of God as well. On October the 6th, 1911, as the messengers from the now 14 churches gathered together here, 2 representatives from the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee were present in that meeting. Among those were Ambrose Jessup Tomlinson, A.J. Tomlinson, one of the principal founders of the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. The other was Joseph Llewellyn, who had lived in the vicinity of Jellicoe just a few years earlier. Tomlinson's impact on the Church of God Mountain Assembly was felt immediately, and the interactions between the Mountain Assembly and the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee would continue to have lasting effects on the development of our organization. So let's talk a little bit about Tomlinson's first visit to the Mountain Assembly. When the business opened for the 5th General Assembly here at Siler's Chapel in October 1911, Tomlinson prayed the prayer before John Parks preached the introductory sermon. Then Tomlinson and Llewellyn were appointed to the reading committee to read the church letters enrolling the messengers into the morning's business. He took the vote for moderator, while Llewellyn took the vote for clerk. Then both preachers preached along with John Parks in the evening service. So Tomlinson's impact was both immediate and long-lasting. The first thing that it did was open up the door for a decade-long mutual fellowship between the two associations. Just a few days after Tomlinson's visit here to Siler's Chapel, he wrote in his diary, "Just arrived home from Kentucky, where I was there for 3 days in an assembly of the churches. Preached 2 sermons besides other talks and interpretations of messages in tongues. Had a good time and pleasant fellowship with the precious people in their assembly. Gave some messages and interpretations, and while under the power, the people saw the fire as it was above my head and about me. The people were so wonderfully blessed that they asked the Lord to enlarge them and make them able to ensure the blessings of God was favoring with them." After receiving the messengers from Cleveland, the Mountain Assembly then voted to send 5 messengers to Cleveland for their annual assembly in January of 1912. Just like they had done in the Baptist Association, we're sending representatives from one association to the other, from the South Union Association to the West Union or the East Union Association of Baptist Churches or the other various Baptist associations in this area. The Mountain Assembly voted in 1911 to send representatives to the visiting assembly in Cleveland. And so in January, John Parks, Stephen Bryant, William Hicks, Jonas Shelton, and Josiah Thomas attended the assembly in Cleveland. There they were greeted as delegates, as fraternal delegates. They were offered the right hand of fellowship. The Church of God appointed a committee to confer with the Kentucky brethren about a union. And the terms included the reception of all the churches of the Mountain Assembly as a whole, as long as they were free from the use of tobacco, that they had that the ministers would retain their positions as long as they were free from the use of tobacco. They had the baptism of the Holy Ghost as evidenced by speaking in other tongues, and they were not divorced and remarried. Although Shelton and Thomas did join the Church of God, there seemed to be some confusion about the purpose of the meeting. Again, the congregational government of the Baptist roots of our churches would certainly not have permitted John Parks and S.N. Bryant to speak on behalf of the individual churches without those churches voting in their congregations to do so. Tomlinson would return to Lower Up Valley for the 6th General Assembly the following October and preached one night for about an hour and a half after John Parks had preached for an hour. And then the two of them stood outside in the hot sun praying for the sick for quite a while. Tomlinson estimated that 1,500 people attended the service. 5 additional Church of God ministers attended the meeting, and 4 of them preached at that 1912 General Assembly. It was the last time that Tomlinson attended an assembly, but in 1914, the Mountain Assembly sent 7 delegates to Cleveland. More than a dozen volunteered to go to Harriman when the Church of God was scheduled to meet there in 1917. 7 delegates from Cleveland returned to the Mountain Assembly in 1919. This continual fellowship in the early years of the Mountain Assembly featured free exchange of ministers as well as the exposure to ideas and especially the exposure to the episcopal polity of the Church of God on ministers in the Mountain Assembly. In addition to Tomlinson opening the doors to fellowship, his immediate impact is seen in the adoption of a new name. The Church of God had defined the holiness movement to which our founders belonged. In 1911, the delegates voted that the assembly shall be called the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. And so in 1911, here at Siler's Chapel, the representatives that had gathered from the 14 churches voted on a new name to identify their association and to distinguish the particular meeting that took place here from the meeting of the Church of God that took place in Cleveland, Tennessee. I'm told one anecdote that has survived is that the delegates went out into the mountains to pray, and when they came back, the consensus was that Mountain Assembly is what it should be called. And so colloquially, the members of the Church of God Mountain Assembly began to refer to the group in Cleveland as the Cleveland Assembly, as that's where its meeting met, and they refer to themselves as the Mountain Assembly because, again, this is where they assembled in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky and northeastern Tennessee. Now, it is also noteworthy that when the Mountain Assembly incorporated in 1917, it used the name Church of God Incorporated and did not rename the organization until the 1940s, when it stopped using the plural form of the churches of God of the Mountain Assembly to become simply the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly Incorporated. Another immediate impact that Tomlinson had on the Mountain Assembly here at Siler's Chapel in 1911 was on the Mountain Assembly adopting a policy against the use of tobacco. The Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee had already discussed the issue of tobacco multiple times in its general assemblies and had firmly settled against the use of tobacco by January 1911, insisting that members could not use tobacco in any form. The resolution committee presented to the 1911 Mountain Assembly here at Siler's Chapel that the churches of God ordain no minister that will not abstain from the use of tobacco. And so when the question was asked about those who presently use tobacco, the assembly advised that they should quit. After a long discussion by both sides, which lasted till in the evening, with many sobs, groans, amens, and shouts and prayers to God for victory, the moderator called for a vote, and the measure was adopted by the Mountain Assembly by a vote of 18 to 15. When several ministers continued to use tobacco, admonitions seemed to fall on deaf ears. 3 Mountain Assembly congregations and 2 other churches would meet at Hayes Creek in 1916 to form the General Assembly of the Church of God that we'll speak more about in just a moment. Another immediate impact of Tomlinson on the Mountain Assembly here at Siler's Chapel in 1911 was the Mountain Assembly adopting for the first time a standard set of credentials by the association. As had been the custom of the churches in the Baptist Association. Again, the Baptist Church, congregationally governed churches, recognize no authority in the church outside, no ecclesiastical authority outside the local church. And so each church ordained its own clergy, its own ministers, and its own deacons, and issued a letter from the church to such an end. When the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee endorsed Richard Sperling's, one of their founders, credentials from the Christian Union in 1907, it also approved the ordination of Alex Hamby in that meeting. It demonstrated a departure from the congregational polity of Baptist churches in the very first assembly of the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. When Tomlinson attended the Mountain Assembly's convention in 1911, no doubt his influence was involved in this decision that the Mountain Assembly made to issue credentials from the association itself rather than just in the local churches. And so in 1911, the Mountain Assembly voted to give all the ordained ministers of this assembly a certificate from the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. In 1925, the assembly would later vote to have some blank ordination paper struck. They printed 500 new credentials, new ordination certificates. And in 1936, the Mountain Assembly voted to order an official seal to attach to those credentials. And so again, the impact of Tomlinson on the Mountain Assembly in this very first assembly can be seen in several different ways. And this influence of the Church of God on the Mountain Assembly would continue throughout the 1910s and into the 1920s. One of the ways in which this continued influence would manifest itself is in the publication of a denominational paper or a denominational periodical. And so this begins with a preacher by the name of Jonah Love Shelton. J.L. Shelton was a Free Will Baptist minister from North Carolina who came to southeastern Kentucky, where he experienced the experience of entire sanctification in Harlan County, Kentucky in 1905. By 1908, Shelton was living in Whitley County, where he met John Parks and others that were affiliated with the Church of God Mountain Assembly. In 1909, he joined the Mountain Assembly Church at Rains Grove in Caryville, Tennessee. The Rains Grove Church was a product, no doubt, of some of the members at the church at Woldridge, Tennessee. By 1909, the church at Woldridge had already disbanded. Most of its members would merge together with the Lower Elk Valley Church, but William Hicks, who was instrumental in the founding of the church at Woldridge, had relocated to Caryville, Tennessee, and near Hicks Station, a railroad station on the Lincoln and Nashville Railroad, he founded a church that he named Rains Grove. And it was there that Jonah Shelton joined the Church of God Mountain Assembly in 1909. Later that same year, Shelton moved to Dickson County, Tennessee, but he was retained as a minister by the Church of God Mountain Assembly. In 1910, Shelton had acquired a bundle of sample papers from A.J. Tomlinson. The Church of God Evangel had begun to be published by the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee earlier that year. And when Shelton got his hands on a bundle of those papers, reading the various news that had come in from the readers of the paper, Shelton was determined to see a holiness paper like this in the mountains of Kentucky. In January 1911, Shelton attended the assembly in Cleveland, Tennessee, and he spoke on the need for a minister's training school. Later that year, Shelton moved back to Whitley County, Kentucky, and there he started a paper that he first began to envision a year preceding that he named the Mountain Evangel. Again, the Church of God's paper was called the Church of God Evangel, and for a similar vehicle in the mountains of Kentucky, Shelton thought it appropriate to name it the Mountain Evangel. I mentioned earlier that Shelton was one of the 5 messengers that represented the Mountain Assembly in Cleveland in January 1912. And while Shelton was there, he took fellowship with the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee, and received credentials from them. And so once Shelton joined the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee, he stopped the publication of the Mountain Evangel and combined its subscriptions with the subscriptions of the Church of God Evangel. And so for several years after that, subscribers, people who had already subscribed to the Mountain Evangel, were receiving the Church of God Evangel for the completion of their subscription. Oftentimes, not only were Mountain Assembly people reading news from congregations in churches in the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, but they also were writing to the Evangel and reporting about the works in those Mountain Assembly churches. By 1915, Shelton had moved back to North Carolina and was briefly there until he returned back to Whitley County in 1916. And that year, Shelton represented the Mountain Assembly Church at Emlyn, Kentucky, that had just been organized a couple of years earlier, and shortly thereafter began publishing another periodical here in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky that he named The Old Paths. And so a second periodical that was organized and founded by Jonah Shelton was published in 1916 under the name The Old Paths. In 1917, Shelton again returned to the Church of God, and when he did, one more time, he delivered his present subscription list to the Church of God Evangel and merged the two papers. And so once again, for the next year or so, many subscribers to the Old Paths were now receiving the Church of God Evangel. They were writing to and reading the reports of Church of God congregations all over America. And so again, we see the influence of the Church of God on the Mountain Assembly in the development of not only one, but two denominational periodicals. Even though both of those were short-lived as far as the Mountain Assembly was concerned, the continued influence by many Mountain Assembly readers reading the Church of God Evangel on a regular basis exposed the ministers in the Mountain Assembly to the Church of God. Another important impact that the Church of God had on the Mountain Assembly in the 1910s was over the adoption of standard resolutions. The Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee did not formally adopt its constitution until 1921. Tomlinson explained that in the adoption of the Constitution of the Church of God, it merely contained that which we've been practicing for years. As a judicial body, the General Assembly prayerfully discussed issues before settling on a consensus. Keeping the record of the minutes then was vital for continuity. Along the same lines, in the Mountain Assembly, in 1915, the Mountain Assembly voted in the 1915 General Assembly to review the previous minutes to determine which resolutions to retain. And so they specifically looked back at the resolutions that had been adopted in the 1907 Assembly, the 1911, 1912, 1913, and 1914 minute books, and pulled forward. They voted to hold such resolutions as which would be best for the churches. And so these standard resolutions would be carried forward from year to year in the minute book of the Mountain Assembly. By 1925, the minute book would print all valid resolutions carried forward each year. And so this began this process of forming a governmental policy for the Mountain Assembly. In 2000, these standard resolutions would be revised and reconstituted as the Church of God Mountain Assembly's constitutional declaration and bylaws. And so the formation of a founding document or a governmental policy was certainly due to the influence of the Church of God. Whereas in the Baptist Association for decades, the resolutions that were adopted each year, they only had the effect for that particular year. There were no standard or permanent resolutions or laws that governed the churches in the Baptist Association. Another area of influence that the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee had on the Mountain Assembly is in the area of teachings. The Mountain Assembly in 1907 adopted 6 articles of faith at its very first assembly. It adopted another list of 11 10 years later. That same year, the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee published its standard teachings in the Minute Book. In 1920, the Mountain Assembly published about 30 articles and doctrines of the Church of God. Of this list that was published in 1930, or 1920 rather, by the Mountain Assembly, of this list of 30, the first 27 were nearly identical in wording, and they appeared in the same order as those that had been adopted by the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. And so the teachings of the Mountain Assembly, for all intents and purposes, were copied from the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. Another important area in which the Church of God in Cleveland influenced the Mountain Assembly was in the adoption of a board of elders. In 1917, the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee adopted and established a council of elders to help guide and administrate the affairs of the church. And so it's interesting also to note that of the first 12 elders that were appointed by the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee, of those first 12, 5 of them had attended a Mountain Assembly in the 1910s. In 1919, the Mountain Assembly appointed 12 men to plan together with each church as far as our work will extend. And so this first elder board was constituted in 1919 in the Mountain Assembly. By 1921, again, the tensions between congregational government and a more episcopal polity were strained. And so in 1921, the Mountain Assembly voted to disband the Board of Elders. The following year, it returned to the need for a board of elders, and this time created a board of 6 elders. The following year, there was more discussion on the necessity of a board of elders, and it was increased. The board of elders was increased to 12 members. In 1930, as a result of some of the elders having left the Mountain Assembly, some having died, by 1930, the Mountain Assembly reconstituted the idea of a board of 12 elders, this time to look after the interest of the said Mountain Assembly and to be subject to the orders of said assembly. And so 12 men were appointed in 1930 to a reconstituted board of 12 elders. Our current current Board of 12 Elders can trace its lineage all the way back to 1930 in an unbroken succession of those 12 seats. In 1944, with the new system of government that was established that we'll talk about in a couple lectures down the road, the Board of 12 Elders was also reconstituted again, this time as a judicial body for the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Another area in which the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee would influence the Mountain Assembly in the 1910s was in the development of a tithe of tithes financial system. The Church of God in Cleveland had adopted a tithe system between 1913 and 1917, working out the details of such until finally they determined that each church would set aside 10% of its tithes received from the members and send those to the district or to the state and to the national offices of the Church of God. This system of tithe of tithes came up at a ministers' meeting at Pleasant View, Kentucky in 1917 prior to the General Assembly. While it was discussed at that ministers' meeting, it was not yet adopted. But in 1919, a version of it that had been presented in 1917 was adopted by the Church of God Mountain Assembly, where they asked members to contribute, or they asked churches to contribute 10% of the tithes that were paid by members into the local churches. Again, this financial system would build a strong central government for the Church of God Mountain Assembly, whereas in the Baptist Association, there was no regular stewardship program and there was no ecclesiastical leadership in the Baptist Association. Another way in which the Church of God influenced the Mountain Assembly during this period of time was the establishment of a headquarters. A.J. Tomlinson moved into the city of Cleveland in 1904 and centered the activities of the Church of God in that city. In 1918, the Church of God opened the Bible training school in the city of Cleveland. Of course, later it would become known as Lee College and then Lee University. In 1918, the church also built in 1920, the church also built an auditorium in the city of Cleveland and in order to host the annual General Assembly for the churches of God in that city. And so it settled the idea of having a headquarters for the various churches that were a part of the denomination. In 1920, the Mountain Assembly appointed a committee to select a place to hold our annual assembly each year. Up until that time, the assembly had been voting at the end of each session where it would have its next year's meeting. And so we mentioned in the first lecture how that the first assembly was held at Little Wolf Creek. The second was held at Zion Hill. The third was held at Hayes Creek. The fourth was held at Jellicoe Creek. The fifth was held here at Siler's Chapel, and so on. And so by 1920, there had been several meetings in a row, several assemblies in a row that had met at Lower Elk Valley, just outside of Jellicoe, Tennessee. This was probably largely due to the church there being somewhat closely in proximity to many of the other churches, but also the idea was that it was one of the larger churches that had, by this point in time, had the most members, and so it had already become a significant church in the Mountain Assembly. And so in 1920, the delegates at the assembly voted to select a place to hold our annual assembly, and the committee decided on Williamsburg, Kentucky. Now, plans would change. A piece of property had been selected in the city of Williamsburg, not far from the train depot. Plans would change, and as it turns out, the church at Pleasant View would end up relocating from Pleasant View, Kentucky into the city of Williamsburg, and they would construct a church on that piece of property that was intended to be a tabernacle. But after the plans had changed, construction on a tabernacle was completed in time for the 1922 assembly on Florence Avenue inside the city of Jellicoe. It was voted that year to allow the Lower Elk Valley Church to take over the building and to dispose of its old building however they saw fit. And so over the next couple of years, the Lower Elk Valley Church relocated from the old Hackler Schoolhouse at Oswego to Florence Avenue to the Tabernacle in Jellicoe. In 1924, discussion turned toward erecting a mess hall to help feed those who attended the General Assembly. We talked in the last session about the hospitality of the community. And so the Mountain Assembly said, let's build us a mess hall. Let's build a cafeteria where the members can gather and be fed as they gather in. This project was abandoned because the following year a fire necessitated major reconstruction on the tabernacle. In 1926, the Lower Elk Valley Church completed its move into the newly remodeled sanctuary and ultimately disposed of the building at the old Hackler Schoolhouse. By 1928, the attendance was good. The house was crowded, and many outside had not been able to even come in to the building. So the tabernacle, not being large enough to hold the people all through the 5 days and through the 5 services, was a phenomenon that had occurred already before the tabernacle was even 5 years old. Another important role that the Church of God played on the Mountain Assembly was over the necessity to create a trustee board to care for the jointly held property of the association. With the building of a tabernacle that all the churches would have a mutual ownership of, the Mountain Assembly saw the need to appoint trustees to look after the property of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. In 1920, it was moved in order that F.M. Thomas, G.A. Fore, and J.C. Taylor be appointed trustees to receive a deed and look after the property for the assembly known as the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. In 1923, there was a question asked about what should be done, about outsiders, about non-members coming in to our church houses, breaking locks and taking possession. Apparently there was some vandalism that took place in some of the churches. And so the Mountain Assembly voted that each church should appoint 3 trustees, and that the Mountain Assembly should appoint 3 trustees to care for the property of the local churches and the property that was held jointly by all of the churches. And so that year, Kurt Walker, S.N. Bryant, and J.H. Parks were appointed to select the 3 trustees to care for the property of the assembly, and they selected Gilbert Weaver, John Shepard, and J.T. Richardson. In 1925, there arose a legal dispute over a church building in Harlan, Kentucky. The building was disputed when a faction of the church wanted to join the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. And because of that faction and the legal dispute that went to court over it, the Mountain Assembly began to see the need to protect its assets by asking the local churches to deed the property of the church to the Church of God Mountain Assembly and give the general trustees the oversight of all of the property. And so in 1928, the Mountain Assembly moved in order that the local trustees of each church send their deeds to the assembly trustees, and moved that the assembly trustees place them in a safety vault at the First National Bank in Jellicoe for safekeeping. And so again, you can see in these different areas in which over the 1910s and early 1920s, the Church of God continued to wield influence over the Mountain Assembly. Let's talk a little bit about some of the disruptions that took place during this same period of time. I mentioned earlier the issue of tobacco that divided the assembly. You can see how close the vote was in 1911 here at Siler's Chapel, that there were still some members and ministers in the Mountain Assembly that were struggling with nicotine addiction or in the early days of the Mountain Assembly. And so this tobacco issue that was brought up first in 1911 continued to drag on over the next several years. In 1911, the Mountain Assembly voted that the Church of God ordain no minister that will not abstain from the use of tobacco. And so the question was asked about the brethren that use it now, and the advice was given that they should quit. And so again, the church was very divided on this issue, and as a result of it, it would ultimately lead to, in the immediate response was apparently some of the men were unhappy with the vote and maybe even left the meeting. There was a resolution that was adopted shortly after that the withdrawn members from the Church of God be reconciled to their church or keep silent in the churches of God. By 1913, the Mountain Assembly adopted a resolution, be it resolved that it be a debar of fellowship for the ministers of the Church of God to advocate the use of tobacco in any way. Furthermore, be it resolved that preachers or any members of the churches that use tobacco then claim that the Lord took the taste away, or that he spoke some way and told them to quit its use, then go back to using it again, that their church compare charges against such members. By 1915, there was a motion and a second that this assembly withdraws its fellowship from every preaching brother that will not totally abstain from the use of tobacco from this time on. There was also a motion and a second to appoint ministers to go to the churches where those brethren that use tobacco have the care of. And so E.J. Roundtree was appointed to go to Zion Hill, where W.R. Hamlin was pastoring there, and also at Rock Creek, and also that Kurt Walker and Lewis Broyles go to Hayes Creek, where E.L. Lovett was pastoring the church at Hayes Creek. By the following year, the churches at Rock Creek and at Hayes Creek and at Zion Hill had already met together at Hayes Creek and reorganized a new association that they named the General Assembly of the Church of God. And so by 1918, when the news of this breakaway, when the news of this schism had reached the Mountain Assembly, then the delegates there voted in 1918 to exclude from this assembly the churches at Zion Hill and Hayes Creek and Rock Creek for refusing to accept the counsel of this assembly, and to notify them not to use the date of our organization, that was August the 24th, 1907, nor the name of our assembly, nor the time of our annual meeting, which is the first Friday and Saturday in October of each year. In 1925, the Mountain Assembly went a little further and made a motion to not receive members into our body that are baptized by excluded members, specifically naming W.R. Hamlin and others, until they be rebaptized again by legal ordained ministers. And so this first schism that took place in the middle of the first, or in 1916 in the Mountain Assembly, was a result of the use of tobacco by some of the ministers and some of the members in some of the churches, and it led to the formation of the General Assembly of the Church of God, which continues to meet even up until this present time with their tabernacle headquarters in Pine Knot, Kentucky. A second schism also occurred almost simultaneously within the Mountain Assembly as a result of the ministry of Charles T. Pratt. Charles Thomas Pratt had been ordained in the newly constituted Church of God Mountain Assembly congregation at Goldbug, just outside of Williamsburg in 1910. The church lettered in the following year, and Pratt was among those delegates who represented the church. He attended in 1912. He attended his first assembly. Pratt would hold a tent revival in Bartow County, Georgia, and planted a church at Cass Station, Georgia, as a result of the successful revival there. In 1913, the church from Cass Station, Georgia, lettered into the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Pratt disappears from the record of the Mountain Assembly by 1914. Very briefly, he joined the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. There he was disfellowshipped for conduct unbecoming of a minister. Pratt began to, not long after this, he returned to the Mountain Assembly and began preaching an unorthodox eschatology. At a ministers' meeting in 1917 in Middlesboro, Kentucky, Pratt began to preach that the Church of God was living in the millennial reign. Pratt claimed to have had a vision of the devil in chains and said the devil is in bondage. And he began to preach that we were living in the millennial reign. In Christmas of 1916, Pratt had already established a new association in Knoxville. And in 1919, he chartered an organization in Georgia. When the Mountain Assembly learned of Pratt's eschatological views, it adopted in 1917 a doctrinal statement on the issue. The Mountain Assembly adopted the resolution, "We believe in the millennial reign in accordance as the scriptures referred to in Revelation 5 and 20 and 11 and also in 2 Timothy chapter number 2. And so again, we see a second schism that results as a doctrinal issue. And of course, the Church of God of the Union Assembly that was established by Pratt and chartered in Georgia in 1919 continues to operate until this day. Now, it's also noteworthy for us to mention that in addition to the two schisms that resulted in the formation of two separate denominations or two separate church organizations, that there was also another quasi-schism that took place in the 1920s. This schism, if you will, was more a departure of a number of our ministers from the Mountain Assembly, leaving the Mountain Assembly to go and join the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. I already mentioned the fluidity with which Jonas Shelton's membership was transferred and his credentials transferred back and forth from the Mountain Assembly to the Church of God in the 1910s. And so this pattern continued in some places. In 1922, George A. Ford was elected moderator of the Mountain Assembly. This was the first assembly that was held in the New Tabernacle in Jellicoe. Ford had just relocated his congregation from Pleasant View to Williamsburg and was pastoring the church in Williamsburg, Kentucky. Ford got up to preach in the assembly that year, and he preached on a subject called theocratic government. This is government that is directly, the church being directly governed by God. Of course, readers of the Church of God Evangel will know that this idea was first promulgated by A.J. Tomlinson in some of his preaching and in some of the articles that he wrote for the Church of God Evangel. And so it became apparent that Ford was advocating in favor of a new form of government, a new polity for the Mountain Assembly. And Ford was elected moderator in 1922. His assistant moderator was James Lee Goins. Starling Smith was elected clerk, and Francis Marion Thomas was elected assistant clerk. And also, Thomas had been elected as the treasurer for the Mountain Assembly. The first treasurer in the Mountain Assembly. His duties included securing the funds and making the payments on the new tabernacle property there in Jellicoe. And so again, for almost certainly read Tomlinson's sermon in the Evangel the previous year and had already bought into the idea of a new form of Episcopal government for the Mountain Assembly. 6 weeks after the conclusion of the 16th General Assembly, just 6 weeks after the close of business, when Ford had been elected moderator, then Ford, Starling Smith, the clerk, and F.M. Thomas, the assistant clerk, and the Williamsburg Church left the Mountain Assembly and joined the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. Ford had pastored the church at Pleasant View 7 of the previous 9 years. Smith joined him there as a co-pastor in 1922. Thomas had been the clerk of that church since its inception. Again, Thomas was one of John Parks's cousins who had experienced entire sanctification in the revival there in the Pleasant View community in 1899. And so in 1921, Ford and Thomas had relocated the Pleasant View Church into the city limits of Williamsburg. They had erected a new building on the lot where the tabernacle had been proposed the previous year. And after 1922, the church became known as Green Street Church of God and continued to operate with that name for over 100 years. In April of 2025, the church was reconstituted as a church plant in the city of Williamsburg, meeting there on that same location. As a result of Ford's influence, the congregations that he had pastored in Twyla, Kentucky and in Harlan, Kentucky also joined the Church of God later that year, along with at least 5 additional ministers. And of course, this situation left the Mountain Assembly in a state of turmoil. Parks would write at the publication of the minute book that year, he would preface the book with, to whom it may concern, be it known to the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God that our brethren have left and gone to the Cleveland Assembly, leaving the work of the church in hard condition. Each church should take their stand. G.A. Ford was the moderator, Starling Smith was clerk, F.M. Thomas was general treasurer, have joined the church of Cleveland Church. Therefore, they have no right to hold property of the assembly in their possession. It was their choice. Now, in the immediate aftermath, J.L. Goins was the lone official that was elected in 1922 who did not immediately join the Church of God in Cleveland. Instead, Goins spent the next few years working for a union of the two assemblies. He desired that the Mountain Assembly would unconditionally unite with the Church of God. On September the 3rd, 1925, Goins introduced a motion at the 19th annual session of the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God to that effect. By a small margin, the motion was defeated. And so instead, the delegates voted that we will not consider a union with the Cleveland Assembly unless they send messengers from their assembly to one of our lawful assemblies. When Goins' motion failed to unite the two assemblies together, the minister then asked the Mountain Assembly to grant him a letter of recommendation as he was leaving. Goins met with Ford the same day in Williamsburg, was examined by him for credentials with the Church of God. In all, Goins was credited with bringing 9 churches from the Mountain Assembly into the Church of God with about 1,000 members in the church. And so a year after Ford left, the Church of God experienced its own split over a change of leadership. The faction that was loyal to A.J. Tomlinson would go on to be called the Church of God of Prophecy. And so this disruption in the Church of God in Cleveland probably contributed to the waning influence on the Mountain Assembly, along with the defection of some of its leaders. These two factors together helped to contribute to less interaction between the Mountain Assembly and the Church of God. Now, the Mountain Assembly would continue to be influenced somewhat by the Church of God over the next few decades, but those relations would sour somewhat over disputes in the local congregations. The one church in particular that I mentioned that had a legal dispute over the property. And so in our next lecture, We'll continue to explore the relationship between the Mountain Assembly with the Church of God, but we'll also look at a new leadership dynamic that emerged within it, sort of an informal triumvirate that helped govern and guide the Mountain Assembly through the 1920s and into the 1930s. But we'll also talk about the important feature of the late 20s and early 30s, that is the expansion of the Mountain Assembly outside the mountains of southeastern Kentucky and northeastern Tennessee, the crossing of the Ohio River, and the establishment of lasting churches outside of the mountains. And so thank you for joining us for this lecture, and we look forward to continuing our discussion in the next lecture.